I was a child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, I remember going with my family to Disneyland. Not Disney World. It was before Disney World existed. It was Disneyland in California. And I remember that it was a very bright, sunny day, lots of people. And we were walking down one of these, big walking streets. And I remember seeing to my left one of these big, large water lagoons. And it was a ride on the theme of 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. It was one, they had that popular movie back in the 50s, and they made this ride. And what I remember is these cool-looking submarines. They were half submerged, and they were on those tracks, and they were following one after the other, going through this maze. And I was on the other side of the walking street, and so I just instinctively wanted to run over to see them more closely. And as I went over and I looked, I wanted to tell my family, let's go on the ride. But when I turned and looked, they were nowhere to be found. All I saw were all these people going and coming, all of these voices and noises, and I panicked. I was just a little boy. And I called out to the top of my voice, "Mommy!" And right away I heard the voice of my mother responding back from the other side. And I made a beeline, hearing the voice of my mother. I made a beeline through all those people as she did the same. And we met right in the middle, and we embraced. And it was just for a moment, but I was lost but now found. Very relieved. And by the way, we went on the ride right after that, too. But I think back on that, and I'm amazed that with all of those people and all of those voices, the cacophony of noises, I could hear and recognize the voice of my mother. And she, in turn, could hear and recognize my voice. Back in the time of Jesus, and I suppose even to some extent today, in the Middle East, when shepherds would have to put their sheep in a place of shelter during a storm, sometimes there would be 2 or more shepherds that would have to bring their sheep together in a stall or a cave. And after the storm would pass, how do you suppose these shepherds would distinguish and separate their sheep from the others? It was very simple. One shepherd at a time would come out some distance from the entrance, and he would call out his sheep. And his sheep alone, hearing and recognizing his voice, would come out and follow him. And I suppose that is the very image that Jesus was using in today's gospel. Let me read this word for word so that we can get this image in our minds. And the sheep hear his voice, the shepherd, as the shepherd calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he has driven them all out on his own, he walks ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they recognize his voice. Now, why do you suppose Jesus would use that image? Now, we're at a bit of a disadvantage because we're hearing just a short passage from John's gospel. We probably forgot the story that immediately precedes this passage. Now, we heard it. We heard it on the 4th Sunday of Lent. Do you remember what was on the 4th Sunday of Lent? You do? He's just kidding. Well, you'll remember as soon as I tell you. It was about when Jesus cured the man born blind. You remember that story? And we read the whole chapter. And Jesus cures this man, and in the end, he goes from seeing Jesus as a man to a prophet and finally claiming him as Lord. But the others there, especially the Pharisees, were still debating and arguing with this man and his parents and the others. Who is he? Is he just a man, a sinner? Is he a prophet? Could he indeed be the Messiah? And so they were debating all of these things, and they came to their own conclusions. Some were still questioning. And now today we pick up where we left off. Because Jesus now responds for himself. And he uses this analogy of the shepherd and the sheep. Now, you know, when we think of leaders, we don't normally think of shepherds and sheep, but they back then saw that as the ideal comparison. Because why? Most leaders today, presidents and prime ministers and even CEOs of large corporations, do not know the people to whom they lead. Maybe just a small group. But back then, the ideal king was one who knew his people. And those people knew their king and followed him freely, joyfully, enthusiastically, like a shepherd leading his flock. You know, my friends, there are many people today, as there were back then, who claimed to be leaders, who claimed many things, revolutionaries, those who wanted to side on the oppressors, these brigands and robbers who wanted people to follow them, even people claiming to be the Messiah. So how does Jesus distinguish himself from all of those? He cured this man born blind, and the man follows him freely and knows he is Lord. And this is what Jesus upholds. For I am the shepherd, and my sheep know me, and they follow me. Not by deception, not by manipulation, not by coercion, not by force, but willingly, joyfully, enthusiastically. Jesus still calls us today. Do we hear his voice? Do we recognize it? Do we follow him? I was told of an incident that took place, I think it was this last Christmas at another church. And they were doing a fundraiser. It was during the Advent season, and they were doing one of these dinner theater things in the parish hall. And some of the volunteers in the parish, made one of these makeshift stages. And the play was the classic from Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol. And they made a nice homemade backdrop, painted, the 19th century London with the tenement buildings and the sooty chimneys. And they had all of the tables and the fold-out chairs arranged so it was facing the makeshift stage. People were given the programs as they were walking in. And as they looked at the program, many of them were amused at who was playing the character of Ebenezer Scrooge, because he was a man who was well known in the parish, very active in various committees and ministries. He was a man that was gentle, kind, generous, very un-Scrooged-like. But they were impressed once the play started because he really got into the character. Very grumpy, miserly, really with gusto saying, "Bah, humbug!" And when the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future came to him, he really took on that dreadful fright. And as we all know the story at the end, he had this transformation from being grumpy and stubborn and miserly to being joyful and enthusiastic and kind and generous. And in the play, of course, they had this very homemade makeshift stage. He opened up this window and he was pretending to look down upon the street, if you remember the story. And there's a boy walking by. But there was no boy playing the character in the play. He was pretending to see the boy. And with much enthusiasm, he said, "You there, young man, come here, boy. I have something wonderful for you to do." Now, even though there was no boy playing the character, there was a boy sitting at one of the tables in the hall, and he thought that he was calling him. And so the little boy got up, maybe 5, 6 years old, and enthusiastically ran up to the stage and climbed up and was waiting to hear the wonderful thing he was supposed to do. Now we had an unscripted moment. And the character who played Scrooge was not sure what to do. He hesitated for a moment. And you can imagine the audience was holding their breath. What is he going to do? And so the character playing Scrooge went out of character. In fact, maybe he was in character with the new Scrooge, because what he did is he went around where he was behind the stage and went in front onto the stage, and he embraced the young boy. And he said, "Yes, indeed, you are the one. You are exactly the one I intended." And he took him by the hand and he led him back down to the table where his family was. And at the end, at the curtain call, where the final bows were made, the last one to bow was, of course, the character who played Scrooge. And he brought onto the stage that little boy. And I was told that the audience saved their loudest and warmest applause for them. My friends, we hear so many voices in our lives. A cacophony of sounds calling us to follow those voices. Many of them that lead us away from God. And in that maze and cacophony of voices, do we hear the voice of our Lord calling us? Do we recognize it? Do we put all those voices aside and follow him? I pray that the Lord will give us that grace to respond with great enthusiasm, like that boy, and to make a beeline towards the stage of life, waiting to hear from our Lord that wonderful thing that we are called to do. Because we too are the ones that he intends, calling us by name, for we are exactly the ones that he calls each and every one to himself. God bless you.